My brain just died. All those who seek their life will lose it, and all those who lose their life for my sake.
Mm-hmm.
Let me repeat that without stuttering. It reminds me of the biblical verse. All those who seek their life will lose it, and all those who lose their. I hope that you're going to be editing this.
Yeah, but it's going in the beginning.
So repeating once again. Welcome back to the Christ in Culture. This is Steve.
And this is Gordon. And this is take 2 on trying to record this episode for you guys.
So we found out that our recording equipment, Skype, because I'm remote right now, so we're recording 2 separate places, does not like our recording equipment. So we actually had to finagle it a little bit. And because before, Gordon sounded like a robot. And it was Robot Gordon. Robo Gordon.
Gordon.
Yeah. And so it was very interesting. It's not as cool as RoboCop or like...
No, it's not cool at all.
Yeah, it was really bad, actually. So we got like 2 seconds into this video, and I was like, hey, Gordon, you sound like... Or this recording, rather. And I was like, Gordon, you sound terrible. And I meant that with as much love as one can mean when they tell somebody else that they sound like they're a metal can.
Yeah, but apparently the fancier the equipment, the tougher it is for Skype. So we made it as simple as possible, and here we are, trying this again.
Yes, so as I had mentioned, I haven't really intaken any new media since our last recording, but have you taken anything in?
Yes, so I think it's been like 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, but me and Lizzie have been watching a lot of Downton Abbey. That's most of the media I've been intaking. We're almost done with season 2. We love it. I think I've talked to Clint a few times and told him, like, hey, this is what I'm watching. And he's just like, I tried it. I just couldn't get into it. But it's great. I mean, we are attached to characters. Like, when stuff goes down, we're just like, we get all heated or we get all sad. And we're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's happening. And so,
yeah,
we can't get enough.
Yeah, is David Tennant in that?
If he is, he's not in it yet, but I don't think so.
Oh, okay, never mind. I just looked it up. He is, I think, plays as maybe a guest star.
Okay.
Either way, I don't know. I'm not very familiar with it. I mean, I know of the show. It was really big when I was in college. A lot of my friends watched it, but I never really even gave it too much of a chance. So not that like it's not something I would watch. I just haven't. It just isn't something I've gotten around to. So
yeah.
But yeah, very cool.
Yeah. Other than that, it was kind of a while ago, but me and Lizzie also went and saw, because there's like a dollar theater really close to us. Okay. So a while back we went and saw The Upside. Did you ever see that one, or you know what I'm talking about?
I haven't seen it, but yeah, I know what you're talking about.
It was good. It was like a nice feel-good movie. We laughed a whole bunch because Kevin Hart's pretty hilarious.
Yeah, well, Kevin Hart, yeah, he's very, very funny. Yeah, I'd like to see that. I mean, I'm a big fan of
Bryan Cranston.
Those kind of movies.
Oh,
yeah.
Just like feel good.
Yeah, and just also like I assume it's got to be at least somewhat funny, because I imagine Kevin Hart just by who he is.
Yeah, it's very funny.
Yeah. Cool. Anyway, so actually this episode, to segue terribly as I'm ought to do, is a very unique episode, actually. So Ty Halligan, who we mentioned last week as one of our new patrons on Patreon, actually requested this episode a while ago, so we're finally doing that. And it's also kind of at least for me, sort of a thank you to Ty for his support.
Yeah. Yeah, this was requested, I don't know how long. Just kind of found out recently he's kind of a super fan. If you could say we had one, he's up there.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, Gordon, you were the original super fan to the point where Clint and I made you a podcaster with us.
That's true. He could be the 4th.
Could. Yeah.
But yeah, I was kind of going over top. We were trying to knock down topics people have requested. And I was going over the list and I saw, his name. And I was like, well, he's just started like walking alongside us in this. So, yeah, kind of as you said, as a thank you, let's kind of go down this topic. And so he requested a song, which I always love doing songs. It's really interesting in a movie. We can talk about like one theme for like the 40 minutes of the podcast, but like for a song, because there's so many words we're looking at, it just provokes a lot of conversation so easily.
I always like doing songs because of the whole Christ and culture thing that we do.
Right.
I always started doing songs. Like from a young age, I would always kind of like, and by young age, I mean really not that young, but it's something that I've always done is like heard things in songs that reminded me of the faith in some way. So I always like it because I think that songs are really like in a lot of ways modern day poetry, you know? I think no one goes out there and buys books of poetry anymore, but we all listen to songs, and a lot of these songwriters are really good lyricists, and they're actually saying a lot in their words. And so I always appreciate that.
Yeah, I think I can agree. I've just always been drawn to songs. I never really applied, I think, faith stuff to songs growing up, but more recently, like I listen to songs, and usually I picture like either the song as a prayer or the song as like something God is saying, and so it's real fun.
I think for me, I've just seen like parallels, but not even from like the youngest of ages, because I certainly wasn't a young lad in the 90s listening to Backstreet Boys thinking like, where are the Christian themes in this?
God wants me that way.
Oh my, we're going to get that request for a podcast now, and this is your fault. So anyway, song for Ty.
Yes, Kendrick Lamar, he requested How Much a Dollar Cost, which I don't know. Do you know if Kendrick Lamar is Christian?
I don't.
I think he is, sort of.
Well, I mean, he's pretty famous. I don't actually know off the top of my head if he's like explicitly Christian.
Yeah, I don't either.
But I do like a lot of his stuff.
I do too. Yeah, I love Kendrick Lamar.
He the thing with Kendrick that I appreciate, he's very authentic, Like he doesn't really try to be anyone in particular, like he really is, he's actually struggled with stuff, and so he's actually like, I don't know, he just seems very like he's actually talking about something that's real, Yeah,
if you go to his earlier stuff, the first like his mixtapes, it's still very good, but it's kind of your usual, I think not usual, I would say stereotypical kind of like rap songs as well. Still very good stuff. But then in his last two albums, I would say it's kind of like what you said, like where he's picking on very pertinent core issues that he thinks need to be talked on, whether they're personal, whether they're political, whether it's, racial. He kind of just like he's sharing this theme or this message in his songs really well. And so the reason I asked if you thought he was Christian, or if you knew, is because this song, as you will see, is extremely Christian. It's very much a story, and that's what it is. It's a story that talks about like what it means to have mercy and all these things. So we'll get into that, but I was just curious. So it's How Much a Dollar Costs. And to start, the first two lines actually says just that. How much does a dollar really cost? The question is detrimental, paralyzing my thoughts. So kind of to start this podcast, I was wondering if we could just discuss that question. How much does a dollar cost? Whether you want to take that literally or in any other way.
Well, I don't think people listen to this podcast to hear me talk about economic policy. But I will say that, I think that's a really thought-provoking question, because to me, and I don't want to like jump the gun too much on the other themes maybe throughout the rest of the song, but to me, when I hear that question, like how much a dollar really cost, is it's, like the time that's put in for it, or like how much you're willing to sacrifice for that dollar, like how much we're willing to sacrifice for wealth.
Right.
So I was actually talking to a really good friend of mine, Joe, this past weekend, and we were talking about sort of society in general, particularly fatherhood, and how there's a lot of things in our society that have come about because of just like a breakdown of family. And yes, like, in a lot of cases, it's where the father isn't around, but sometimes they're physically around, but emotionally they're not. and how detrimental that is, especially as Christians, for us to understand God as a loving father when we either don't know our father or they're emotionally distant or they're not really invested in our lives, right? And that there's a certain sense of machismo, in that, right? Like, oh, like that, like that's for, the mom to take care of. And that's actually more of a relatively new phenomenon. Some scholars will say, like, a lot of people point to World War II, because a lot of those guys came back with a lot of like PTSD, and alcoholism was very prevalent. But probably even before that, people used to be farmers and carpenters and the like before sort of moving to the city. And so then they moved to the city and they started working 16-hour days, and they went from being incredibly involved in their families' lives to not being involved at all to provide for them, right? And so my question, I guess when I hear that question in light of that conversation is, how much are we sacrificing the love or the importance of family and our loved ones, sort of chasing down wealth, right?
Yeah. And I agree, because I think the play on words within that question is obviously cost and opposed to money. So like, Whataburger costs like $8 for a meal versus like the cost, like you were saying in the beginning, to achieve that dollar, which, like what is the cost? Or in other words, what's the sacrifice being made for that dollar? So like you said, the sacrifice might be less familial time or working more and being less within the family to achieve wealth or whatever that is. And
right.
For some reason, as we're talking about like cost and like that thought, I keep thinking back to the scenes in Infinity War and Endgame with like the Soul Stone. And they're like, how do we get the Soul Stone? And he's like, well, it's a pretty big cost, soul for a soul. And so like there's always some kind of exchange, something being sacrificed.
And I think that's a good thing because, obviously I'm talking just sort of that familiar time. But, I think sometimes we sacrifice even our faith for it, right? That, we might put our prayer life or even maybe not go to church as often because we're like, well, I have to work, or like I'm going to do this job or something like that. And so it ends up being put on the back burner. And for me, that sort of brings up in my mind is Luke chapter 16, verse 13, where no servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon, or mammon was a form of currency. And I think that like that's something that is still a very real struggle, as to like what do we make our God? Is the dollar actually just something that we realize that we're working so that we can, live and survive and maybe provide for our loved ones, or is it something that we're chasing down as our own God?
Right. Something, there's more value in it, that we're putting more value in it, and that's creating more of a cost to achieve. That's less beneficial to ourselves than it should be.
Yeah.
And so then it kind of moves on. So he kind of poses that question, kind of says like that question's been like eating away at him. And he says, there's parasites in my stomach. Keep me with a gut feeling. Got to see how I'm chilling once I park this luxury car, hopping out feeling as big as Mutombo. And so in the beginning, he paints this picture that like with this thought of like how much is this dollar, like what is this? What's the cost? What's lost? It's there's this parasite that's like keeping him with this gut feeling that something's not right in achieving like wealth, or there's something lost in achieving wealth. And I think parasites are a relationship where one thing gets something out of it, and the other thing loses something entirely. And so when I think we're talking about our faith, parasites are definitely just attributed to like sin or Satan, who like wins and we lose. And so it's kind of like, I don't know, but just that idea, he feels uneasy with this idea of what wealth is.
Yeah, well, I think that we get to the point where like whenever we seek something that isn't God, we end up finding that it's empty, like whenever we try to get fulfilled. And so that's maybe how I guess like parasites really work, is they actually take from you, that these parasites draw your blood away, right? They actually take away your life, or your lifeblood. And so, yeah, I think that like that metaphor for sin, realizing that you're actually losing something,
right. Yeah.
And we can either rip off the parasite, right? If it's like a leech that's on us, we can either pull the leech off or continue to let it suck us dry.
Right. The longer we allow it to happen, like the more detrimental it could be too.
Yeah.
And on the other half of that stanza, he's kind of painting this picture of like he's driving in a nice car. He jumps out feeling like this awesome basketball player. And doing some research, I found out like this is kind of where Kendrick got the idea for this song. He was actually riding around in a nice car in a rough area. He would see homeless people on the street, and he was purposely trying to avoid like eye contact or having conversation with them because it made him feel uneasy, like obtaining this wealth through talents that he was given. But now like he was like, I don't want to like have this conversation with you guys because I don't have to explain myself, all these things. There's something that keeps them uneasy, and that's what poses the first question. And I think it's pretty common today.
Yeah, no, that actually really speaks to me because, I mean, obviously doing what I do, I really think and truly believe that, you know, like my money isn't really mine. You know, like ultimately everything I have is gifted to me by God. And so I think when we're like avoiding the homeless, then we're really missing out on Matthew 25. You know, like if we're not giving of ourselves, then we've really, I think, missed something. And I think that's what's making him uneasy, is knowing that he has the means to make a difference in somebody's life, but he's not. You know, he's avoiding it. He's serving mammon instead of God. You know,
totally. He gets to a gas station, goes and gets gas, and then he says he walked out of the gas station. A homeless man with a semi-tan complexion asked me for 10 rand, stressing about dry land. Rand kind of paints the picture that he's in Africa, because rand is the currency for $1 there.
Okay.
And so there's this homeless person outside, and they're like, "Can I have $1?" And then he ends with like stressing about dry land, which dry land for, I think, the situation means like he's where, if they're in Africa, and from kind of the research I was doing on this song, like where he's trying to paint the picture, some of the nicer people have more like the areas they live in are less dry, and so he's stressing about like the area that he's stuck in. So it's either his homeless situation or whatever, but it also could be some kind of struggle that got him there, whether it was like addiction or work or something like that. So he's stressing about this issue into his current situation. But on the flip side, whenever I hear dry land, I think of like the book of Exodus and the desert.
Yeah, for sure. I also think of like almost like a dryness of faith, you know, to like whenever we refer to that, it's like, you know, when you hear of Christ, he is the living water, right? This well you would drink and you will never thirst, right? That well is the one that doesn't dry, right? Run dry.
Right.
And so something I think about that. And so, yeah, I think it's really talking about like struggle and poverty. But I also think that, you know, it's also talking about like a spiritual poverty, maybe, you know, of like human connection, especially when you're talking about homeless. I often wonder, you know, we all desire to be loved and seen. And I think one of the tragedies with homeless people is that we avoid eye contact with them. A lot of people, you know, like we don't want to be bothered. We avoid eye contact. Mm-hmm. And how difficult it must be to not be seen as a person, and what that must do to you, you know, like how much that must cut you to the core. Because there are times in our own lives where we feel like we're not being seen and it hurts us. And yet that's an everyday reality for a lot of people.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think another problem too is coming at this next part where he says, deep water, powder blue skies that crack open, a piece of crack that he wanted. I knew he was smoking. He begged and he pleaded, asked me to feed him twice. I didn't believe it, told him to beat it, contributing money just for his pipe. I couldn't see it. And I think a big problem outside of not being seen as a person is just like the assumptions or the judgment that we can put on homeless, whether like we think that the way they live their life is how they ended up there, or even like the money, if they're asking for like help or money, is not going to something useful. And that's what he's doing right here, where he's assuming that the money he's that $1 he's asking for is going to go to drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a real problem, because you think about judgment and what like true judgment is, like God's judgment, and that's not something we can put on somebody else ourselves.
That's something that I've often struggled with or given a lot of thought to, is really my place to judge whether or not I should give to that person, And should I just should we be assuming the worst, or should we assume the best? And I think like a lot of people that I know will, for him, he's saying, asked me to feed him twice, right? So I think it's interesting because you could easily go and like buy him the food,
Yeah.
So I was in San Antonio about a month ago or so, and I parked my car in like the downtown area because I was just there for a minute. So I popped over to the cathedral. I went to confession, and I came back, and there was a homeless guy there. And well, when I first parked, I saw him there, and I was like, "Hey, like, I'm just about to run into this church," and I told him, and it was like very half-heartedly, but it was like, if I like see an ATM, like I'll see if I can get some cash because I didn't have any on me. And I like went to the church, and I legitimately didn't see one, and so I came back, and I was just like, "Hey, like I didn't really see one." And then he was like, "Well, would you buy me lunch?"
Yeah.
And and that really shook me because I should have offered. It really struck me that I kind of was just like, because I'd seen him in that parking lot before, and I was just kind of like, oh man, like I just don't feel like being bothered. Like, yeah, my life, right? I'm not really seeing him, and I'm making a lot of assumptions and judgments. And so I ended up walking with him about 2 blocks to a gas station, and I bought him like a hot dog and like a bag of chips and like a drink and like a couple other snacks, and had a conversation. And then he didn't like go back. Like he was like, all right, well, I'm gonna head off this way. And I just ended up having a good conversation with him. And what shook me with that conversation was that he was actually just like another person. And that's something that I always knew, I always knew that. Like I've been in downtown Houston and like bought meals for the homeless before, but just whatever that day, I just wasn't. And it was, of course, like when I'm literally going to confessions, like I knew I had to do something, but I didn't see an ATM, and so I was like, okay, well, I don't have to worry about it because I legitimately looked, but I didn't find one. And then he kind of called me out on it, and when that happened, I kind of thought about Jesus's line of, what you do for the least of these, you do for me,
Right.
and like seeing Christ in that moment. And like I really felt like he was Christ in that moment, where I was like, hey, look, I did my best, and he was like, but did you really? And so I got to know him along the way, and kind of like how he got to where he was.
It's like your little road to Emmaus.
Yeah, and then it was really funny because then I got to the little like it wasn't really a gas station, it was more of a convenience store, and like they knew him there. Like that's like a lot of people have come and gotten him meals there, and so like they would, like, I think they threw something in for free for him, and
That's awesome.
yeah, it was a really special sort of opportunity that I think I could have missed if, when he was like, hey, can I buy you lunch? And I was like, oh, look, I don't have time. I got, but I kind of allowed for that, that moment of grace to enter,
Yeah. And so he actually responds, as we move on. He says,
I'm a prophet, Gordon.
I know. You don't have to tell me. No. So he responds as saying, my son, temptation is one thing that I've defeated. Listen to me. I want a single bill from you, nothing less, nothing more. And I told him, I ain't have it, and closed my door. Tell me how much $1 costs, or repeats that like first line. And so with this, he says, temptation is one thing I've defeated. So all I'm asking for you is $1. Like, that's it. And so it made me think of like the question, who defeated temptation for us all?
Yeah.
That being Christ on the cross, And so how can we defeat temptation today? Just like that has nothing to do with like what's in the song, but just that reading that line earlier today that made me think like about just those words, defeated and then temptation together. Like, who defeated temptation? Well, Christ defeated like original sin and wiped that all away from us. So now today, if we cling to Christ, or even like your story, if we see in these moments like an opportunity to do something for Christ, clinging to that cross, then we can defeat the temptation to tell ourselves we've done enough, or like actual temptation of like bigger sins or anything like that. And then even in the end, he repeats that question, how much does $1 cost? And now that he's painted this full picture, we can see that for Kendrick in the song, $1 apparently costs the loss of like his corporal works of mercy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like he's lost mercy.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I also think like, how is it that we sort of defeat temptation? And I think, obviously, like it's through sort of obviously dying to ourselves, right? But I really like that whole imagery, or that question rather, of like who defeated temptation. Because when he says, "My son, temptation is one thing that I've defeated," like for me, I get this image of like Jesus in disguise, you know?
Well, yeah, because he
Uh,
says my son.
yeah, like my son, temptation is one thing I've defeated, and like that, and it was just funny because of like the story that I just talked about at that in San Antonio, and then like I hear that, and I was like, oh man, like
Yeah.
wow, yeah, no, that's really cool. For the record, I have actually never listened to this song, nor did I even look at the lyrics before getting here. So this is all new to me, guys. This is
So
great.
it's good. It's good. So then after we kind of finish that was one big first stanza, we jump into the chorus. And the chorus is kind of, from what I read, it was kind of like from the perspective of God. But you might not know that, like listening to the song or reading the lyrics, but it just says, it's more to feed your mind, water, sun, and love, the one you love, all you need, the air you breathe. And so when you hear that, like the things that you need are water, sun, love, and air. Like these things of, well, three things of nature, and one thing that stems from God. Like if God is love, then that's just strictly God. But other than that, it's also just like things we need. And money's not in there. Your phone isn't in there. Like physical things aren't in there.
Yeah, actually, so what I got, so it's water, sun, and love, the one you love. What strikes me is that it seems like, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's four, right? Because it sort of lists three, and then it sounds like it's more clarifying love, right? The one you love, and I like that it isn't phrased like somebody, like the love you're receiving, but it's about the love you're giving, right? It's about you loving somebody else. It's about having the beloved, which I think is important in the song, because whether or not he realizes, I don't know, but it's very much that corporal work of mercy, right? That it's not so much about what we're receiving as much as what we're giving.
Yeah. And then that last line too, it's like all you need, the air you breathe. And you think about like the idea of like the spirit, being of air and like the breath. And so like we need this love, but we also need to give it. And all we really need though is like that spirit within us and this drive to live out these works of mercy.
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of, for whoever tries to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. It kind of reminds me of that. Yeah. Because realistically, so it's one of those paradoxical things where the more you give, the more fulfilled you are as a person.
Okay.
It's something that at least I found in my life, that when we try to hoard things, love is one of those things particularly, that when we try to hoard it, we just lose it. And it's only by giving it that it grows and spreads and actually fills us, right? It's not something we can just receive, or we can receive, but it's not something we can just take and hoard, or even just receive and hoard, but it's something that is given to be given away. Like a lot of things in faith. And so I think that, when you're driving around and you see that homeless, like Kendrick earlier in the song, and we don't give of ourselves, right? Like we're just like, hey, I don't have it, like leave me alone. Then we end up finding ourselves unhappy. Whereas instead, if we would have taken the time to, get to know that guy, buy him a meal or two, we would find that there would be more love in our hearts, and it would have been a more fulfilling experience.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the Bible verse you mentioned earlier, the Luke 16, like serving two masters. I think like in that moment, like in the car when that happens, or whether you're not in the car, if you're thinking, okay, I want to serve God in this moment, then the obvious answer would be just to go talk to that person. Whereas if you're like, I'm not going to go do that because it's uncomfortable, I don't like it, I have better things to do, then the master you are serving is yourself. Yeah. And you're making yourself the master above God in that moment. In that small decision. It's not huge, and it happens all the time. We all do it. But like ultimately, when you think about that verse, that's what's happening. There's always two masters, and you can only serve one. And depending on the choice, it's either kind of God in that moment or yourself. So yeah, and I think, like you said, I think one snuffs out love because, like we said, God is love, and the other one kind of like provides convenience but doesn't really like stoke the fire that is love. So we don't feel that much. We don't feel like that as much joy as we would if we just served love to someone else in that moment.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. That it's something to be shared.
Yeah.
To be given away.
So moving on, this next stanza is pretty big, but I think it kind of says a lot of the same stuff, but it paints a really good picture, especially because earlier you were talking about the eye contact a lot.
Uh-huh.
And so he's talking about, like, he's trying to leave. He says, staring at me in disbelief. My temper is building. He's staring at me. I grab my key. He's staring at me. I started the car. Then I tried to leave. And something told me to keep it in park until I could see the reason why he was mad at a stranger. Like I was supposed to save him. Like I'm the reason he's homeless and asking me for a favor. He's staring at me. His eyes followed me with no laser. He's staring at me. I notice his stare is contagious because now I'm staring back at him, feeling some type of disrespect. If I could throw a bat at him, it'd be at his neck. I never understood someone begging for goods, asking for handouts, taking if they could, and this particular person just had it down pat. And so in this moment, only seconds have passed, but they make eye contact. And he's leaving. He asked for $1. He said no, he's leaving. And so the homeless guy is just staring at him. And at first he's like, don't stare at me. You're angry. But the stare became contagious to where like he didn't want to leave. He wanted to like see what was happening. And now he's like feeling guilty to the point he's like, what am I supposed to do? Like I didn't put you in this situation. This isn't my fault. Like, why are you staring at me? And it made me think of like Cain and Abel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where, God comes around and he's like, where's your brother? And he's like, am I my brother's keeper? Like, I'm not, I don't tend him. I'm doing my own thing. But yeah, just that idea. And I think that's why we don't like making eye contact sometimes with even normal people, because when we make eye contact, there is this connection. And if we make eye contact with someone that we could benefit and we choose not to, then we start to like do what he did, where he's like, well, it's not my fault that like they're in that situation. I'm not like doing anything negative to them. I'm just choosing not to do anything at all. Yeah.
So for me, the line right here, I never understood someone begging for goods, asking for handouts, taking it if they could. This particular version had it a person just had it down pat. I think that's like a lot of our mindset, especially in sort of modern America, is that we're like, oh man, I can't understand someone who begs or is asking for handouts, and that's like such a taboo thing. And to a certain extent, I understand the sentiment behind it, but I think where it becomes dangerous is where we start to think like we don't need anybody else, and that asking for help is a bad thing, and that we almost look at people who have the strength to ask for help as if something's wrong with them or there's something lesser, because we're not really made to make it through life alone. In a certain sense, we're all beggars, and we all are in need of help from each other. And it kind of goes back to that judgment. It's like, I never understood someone who begging for their goods. Why don't they just earn their own way? Why don't they do something?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things people forget with the homeless is that it's really difficult to get a job when you don't have a permanent address.
Yeah.
In fact, you can't. You really can't get a job unless you have a permanent address in a lot of ways, at least a legitimate job. You have to maybe work under the table. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we forget that even Jesus stumbled and needed Simon to help.
Yeah. Stumbled 3 times.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he kept getting back up. Yeah. And you already said it earlier, but it goes back to that Matthew 25 verse of like, whatever you do for one of the least of these, you do. Whatever you do not do, whatever you do, you either do to me or you do not do to me.
Yeah.
And so like when you judge and you choose to walk away, like with your story, that's something you're doing to Christ too. And in this next verse, kind of closing this part of this verse before the next chorus, he says, staring at me for the longest until he finally asked, have you ever opened up to Exodus 14? A humble man is all that we ever need. Tell me how much $1 cost. In Exodus 14, that is the chapter where the parting of the Red Sea, and the Israelites are saved from the Egyptians and all these things. But when you think about the story so far, Moses in the beginning, because he says a humble man is all that we ever need. And later, I think in one of the letters, Moses is referred to as extremely humble by like St. Paul. But in the beginning, Moses was like, what am I supposed to do? You want me to just go and talk to the Pharaoh? Like, choose somebody else. I don't want to do this. So he was presented this situation to free the Israelites. And he's like, no, God, this is uncomfortable. I don't want to do it. Just like Kendrick is presented this with an opportunity to give this man $1. And he's like, this is uncomfortable. I don't want to do it. Give me something else. And like God proves how he can work miracles in situations in this chapter when he parts the Red Sea, and proves his might when he drowns the Egyptians, people that went against God. Like, so he proves two things. And he's like, all we ever need is Moses, this humble person who eventually succumbed to God's will and saved thousands.
Yeah, I also see the whole notion that sort of Kendrick's problem to this point is his own pride. You
Right.
know, that he's driving around in this nice car. He's got it all. It actually reminds me of, again, of the scripture that is, like money is the root, like when St. Paul says money is the root of all evil.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean? Well, it means that like when you have a lot of money, not saying that money is inherently bad, but when you have a lot of money, is when you can start gaining pride, because you forget what you actually need. You forget that you're in need of God, that you're in need of others. You end up falling into the chief sin of pride, that you can do it all on your own. And so when he says a humble man is all that we ever need, I think it's also important to remember that like a humble man is all that we ever need. Like that's what we need to be. Like we need to remember humility. Like we need to be that humble man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And then it goes back to that chorus. So we hear the same chorus. I won't repeat it, but kind of this thing from God, like all we need is the Son, love, to love. And then it jumps into this last major verse again, like this last big stanza. And it says, guilt tripping and feeling resentment. I never met a transient that demanded attention. They got me frustrated, indecisive, and power tripping. Sour emotions got me looking at the universe different. And so a transient is like another meaning for like homeless. So he's never met like this homeless person that demanded attention. And I think that goes back to what you said in the first part about looking at them as people versus not people. So like he's so surprised that he met this person who, when he said no to his $1, is like looking at him like upset, and he demands not the $1 at this point, but he's like, I just realized like I don't understand why he wants my attention. We're so different, him and I, because he's homeless. I have this really nice car. Why is he talking to me? And I just came tonight from a worship night where we've been going over the Samaritan woman story, where like Jesus says, hey, give me some water. And she goes, why are you, a Jew, asking me for water? He's like, why are you demanding my attention? It was kind of reversed in that role where Jesus wasn't homeless. He wasn't like a transient to her. She was lesser, but still the same thing applies, where it's like, if you're lesser and someone like Jesus approaches you, you're like, why me? And in this situation, when it's us and the homeless approaches you, you're like, why me? We're different, but we're not different.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah. So it goes on, and it says, I should distance myself. I should keep it relentless. My selfishness is what got me here. Who am I kidding? So I'm going to tell you like I told the last bum, crumbs and pennies, I need all mines. And I recognize this type of panhandling all the time. I got better judgment. I know when you're hustling. When I was struggling, I did compromise. Now I comprehend. And so this one is like, I should like walk away. Just like I said, any last bit, my pennies, I need them. But the one thing I love from this part is the last line. When I was struggling, I did compromise. So when I wasn't making good money like I would have given you $1. But now I comprehend what's going on because I have money. I've achieved wealth, and the cost of that has lost my ability to want to give you $1 because I see through some kind of act apparently that you're putting on.
Yeah, again, I think it all really goes back to I think it really goes back to that judgment, you know? And I think it also goes back to what happens when we make something else our God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when we make money our God, then we become jealous, we become hoarders, you know, like we hoard it for ourselves. And then we comprehend, quote unquote, comprehend that these people are just trying to swindle us, you know, like they don't need this money. They're just trying to steal my money. Whereas, you know, when you're struggling, you recognize the need in other people because you recognize the need in yourself and you're much more willing to give.
Totally.
And it reminds me of the scripture where, you know, you've got the wealthy man who gives his
Yes.
money, his tithe, and then you've got the poor woman who gives her two pennies, basically, her two small coins. And, you know, what is it that God honors more? Well, it's those that give of their need instead of just their excess, you know?
Yeah. And I think that's something we've seen so far. It's like, what is this dollar really to Kendrick? In retrospect, it's nothing to him.
Yeah.
And what is this dollar to this homeless person? It means everything.
Yeah.
Like the value of that dollar to each of their is totally different. And so, yeah, that's a good verse. So he said, it ends like this. He said, he looked at me and he said, know the truth. It'll set you free. And this is the homeless person speaking. Know the truth. It'll set you free. You're looking at the Messiah, the Son of Jehovah, the higher power, the choir that spoke the word, the Holy Spirit, the nerve of Nazareth. And I'll tell you just how much $1 cost, the price of having a spot in heaven. Embrace your loss. I am God. Yeah, you go.
Yeah. Hey, so like I said, I didn't know any of this earlier, but I called it. I am a prophet. Yeah, no, I think that's what it is. I mean, that is totally Matthew 25, you know. When I was hungry, you gave me nothing to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink, et cetera, et cetera. Those will answer, Lord, when do we see you hungry and not help you? And truly, I tell you, whatever you did not do for the least of these, you do not do for me. They will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. And it's just one of those things where, you know, Jesus is in the least of those. You know, when I did my mission in India, when I was over in Kolkata, like that was something that I had desired to find, and I truly found was sort of Christ in the poor, and I try to see that now here, even domestically, that it's my chance to console the heart of Christ, you know, console the wounds of Jesus. But yeah, I love that whole spot. And it reminds me too of the rich man who asks, what do I need to do to inherit the kingdom?
Yes, sell all you have.
Yeah, sell all you have and follow me. And it says he went away sad. And Jesus says, it is easier for a camel to pass through the head of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. It's not because like you can't have money and also be holy. It's because you fall into this trap of becoming prideful and forgetting that you need God, or treating that money or anything as your God when God is your God. Not like if we're not willing to give up, if there's something in our lives we're not willing to give up for God, that is the thing we need to give up the most, because it is what's going to prevent us from entering the kingdom.
Yeah.
And so that is the cost of the dollar, right, that we were talking about.
Exactly.
What are we willing to give up? Well, you're willing to give up heaven. You know,
Apparently.
You're willing to give up salvation.
Mm-hmm.
And how many people out there are willing to do that through their actions? Maybe they wouldn't say they are, but through what they do.
Like I said, this stuff, I think it's hard because I know, like, when we talk about, some people can be bogged down of like people talking about the homeless, because there's other ways to serve other people too. It's not just the homeless. But yeah, I think that it just happens all the time. Like this is something I think, especially once you start driving, if you're in a city, like for me being in Houston, when I was in Georgia, being around Atlanta, it was just something you saw and almost saw so much that you just became numb to it. And so you're like, okay, I'll help this one, but by this block, I'm going to be out of things to do. So I'm just not going to help any of them. And there is a price to that. What Jesus ultimately, not the homeless man, but what Jesus ends up saying is like, well, you're doing that against me, and so you're doing that against your place in the kingdom. And then
Yeah.
it ends with this last bridge, kind of sings it very much like the chorus, but it's a bridge. It's a little different. It says, I washed my hands. I said my grace. What more do you want from me? Tears of a clown. Guess I'm not all what it's all meant to be. Shades of gray will never change if I condone. Turn this page. Help me change to right my wrongs.
Yeah.
And I think he's repenting in a sense. It seems like he's realized where he's been placed and realized where he's gotten to. But I love that imagery in the beginning of, like, Pontius Pilate. I washed my hands. I said my grace. Which Pontius Pilate, if you think about that story, he didn't see anything wrong with Jesus. And he thought it was not his fault for where Jesus had gotten up to this point because of the people that brought him there. And so he washed his hands like, I cleanse myself. This is not of me. Do with him what you will, in the sense of, like, you guys do it. But he still played a part. He still had to, like, condemn him because that was a political figure. And I think in this, it goes back to when we think, like, it's not my fault you're homeless. It's not my fault you're in this situation. But still, in this economic sense or in this bigger picture, we all play this part.
Yeah. What strikes me too is I washed my hands. I said my grace. What more do you want from me? He's like, I did all the right things. I was the rich man. I did all the 10 commandments, right? I did, I went through the motions. I did what I needed to do. And then we come face to face with what St. Paul's talking about how you can do everything right, but if you don't have love, it's nothing. And, for all that he was doing, I have the idea of, like, I washed my hands, right? I stopped maybe sinning in some way. I said my grace, I prayed, but he didn't let the gospel translate into his actions. And that's what was called, is it, God doesn't just call us to change. Like, yes, he calls for us to be renewed. He calls for us to take up our cross, die, and then come into new life. But he then calls us to go out into the world and be his hands and feet, and to serve the poor, to change the world. Yeah. And to play our part in that. And I think that's where he's missing. And so I think that's where he starts to have more of that repentance, is that he realizes that just going through the motions isn't enough. He's got to let it change who he is.
I agree. Yeah. And he knows kind of in the end, like, turn this page of like who he was, help me change to right my wrongs. And so, like, he's not saying, like, help my wrongs be right now, but, like, just help me change. So he knows through repentance and prayer and just attempting to try again, that will eventually right his wrongs. But it's not going to be immediate. He has to have a change of heart to begin. Yeah. Cool. Do you have anything else?
I think that's it that I got from it. Do you have a challenge for the week?
I think so. I was thinking on, like, this idea of, like, poor in spirit. And like try to find someone that you see once in your weekly routine that you think is, like, poor in spirit, whether that's, like, spiritually. So, like, some people that don't know who God is are poor in spirit, but they're wealthy and fine. Maybe they're poor in spirit because they are, like, physically poor as well. Maybe it's just someone that you've always seen, they seem fine, but you've kind of, the more you, like, reflect on it prayerfully, you're like, actually, I've never seen them with anybody else. So I don't know if they have any friends. Just something like that. And, like, I don't know, say hello, do something. So I'll give you an option this week. Either do that, like, reflect on somewhere within your routine that you think you can, like, uplift their spirit, or look at the list of corporal works of mercy, like clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, any of those, and, like, pick one to just go out and do this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any shout outs you have besides Ty, obviously?
Yeah, aside from Ty, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I don't know if I mentioned this episode or on our original take at this point, but, I just found out you're kind of a super fan. I mean that, like, with much love and respect, and that's awesome.
Yeah, which is great, because Gordon was our original super fan, and look where that got him.
Exactly.
On the podcast.
I hope we're not repeating ourselves, but I don't remember.
Well, you'll know when we edit.
We had a third patron sign on. His name is Trent Miles, and so I just want to give him a shout out, just because we said we would, but also just shout out to Trent. The three of you, Kinsey, Ty, and Trent together, have helped us reach our first goal on Patreon. We have 2 different goals. One being, if we got so much, we would recuperate the costs we put into this podcast. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen right away, but like now, each year from here on out, we are breaking even for what we do. We've said it before, nothing goes into our pockets. This is all just to, like I said, to pay for what we're putting out for you guys. And now the next goal that we're trying to still raise with more patrons that are needed would be to get better equipment. So we would get better microphones, capabilities to have 3 sets for 3 of us, maybe even video equipment. So we can like kind of, I don't know if you've noticed that stuff's kind of slowed down, but like if we could venture into that, it would be, we need the right equipment to do it.
I still don't have a camera, so it makes things very difficult.
Exactly. So all these things are things that we're working up to. But right now, just thank you 3. Thank you, listeners. Like even the ones that aren't patrons, just for listening. We only exist because you exist. So it means the world to all of us. Yeah. Do you have any shout outs?
I do not at this particular moment, but I will say, just for a little pre-post credit tidbit of information for you, I'm going to tear the veil, peel back the illusion that I'm intelligent, and let you know that before we started recording, we were having some major issues. I couldn't hear Gordon. And I'm like, can you hear me? He's like, I can hear you. He's like shaking his head, yes. And we're like messaging back and forth. And I'm like, I have no idea what's like, all the settings are the same. I have no idea why I can't hear you this time. And he hits me with the silly question, but is your volume up? At the same time, I was checking the volume, and the answer was no. I did not turn the volume on my computer up. So take that for what you will. I hope that you don't think less of me, I hope that you don't discredit everything I just said in this episode. But just keep in mind that if I did say anything that was wrong, this is definitely a thing that I have done before. So thank you guys again. Please be sure to maintain contact with us. Check out our website, thechristinculture.com, to see blogs, videos once you start getting those back up, as well as sort of the full collection of our podcast. Obviously, you can email us, find us on social media, Twitter and Facebook. And just please let us know what you guys are listening to, what you guys like Ty would like to see us do a podcast with. Also, if you guys like the podcast, please prayerfully consider, again, like Ty, becoming a patron on Patreon.
Name drop in that name, huh?
Well, this episode was very much for him. It was something he requested. He kind of, like, the things that we do at the end of the episode, he actually did, and I appreciate it. And so he did it all, and so we just ask if you want to be name dropped like Ty, just do it all, And so seriously, like Gordon had already mentioned with Patreon, I will not beat a dead horse. You guys understand why it's important, but please prayerfully consider it. And thank you guys again for joining us on the adventure.
Yeah, especially you, Ty.
My man Ty.